Jessica.
Can I just get some clarification, Dr. Bloomfield, about when someone is classified as someone who died with COVID-19 or of COVID-19, and then how we list them if they did die of COVID-19?
Yes, so what I can say is right from the start of the pandemic, we've been very inclusive in our approach to categorising deaths as COVID-19 related deaths. So you might recall when we had a number of deaths, sadly, last year related to aged residential care. A number of those people had not actually been swabbed because of the nature of their conditions, but they were categorised as probable cases because of their symptoms and the situation. However, we still included every single one of those in our overall death numbers. So the latest case we had was someone who had a confirmed COVID-19 infection. Whilst they had a significant serious pre-existing illness, we have categorised the death as COVID-19 related.
We are now talking about nearly 400,000 deaths. Everybody seems worried about it. This is what that looks like in the news.
The nation is nearing another horrifying milestone.
The death toll in the U.S. right now is on track to top 400,000 in the next few days.
The United States is on the verge of surpassing 400,000 American lives lost to the virus.
Incoming CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky said that she fears that this country could hit 500,000 dead from the coronavirus by the middle of next month.
I think we still have some dark weeks ahead. We probably are looking at 4,000 deaths or somewhere around there per day from coronavirus in this country for the next several weeks.
For every 4 deaths around the world, 1 is from the United States. That is a staggering number.
Public health officials are now warning that the so-called dark winter isn't over yet.
Obviously, very disturbing news. I don't want to discount those who have lost loved ones throughout this pandemic. But the question really is that lingers, and something that we have been covering for, almost 9 months now in the discussion about this pandemic is, are these all really COVID-19 deaths? Is it possible somehow the calculations are incorrect? Luckily, we're not alone. There have been reports all over the world of people questioning. We remember Italy all the way back when this pandemic started saying, really it appears that only about 9 to 12% of the amount of people we reported as dying from COVID-19 actually died of other causes. But this is now really becoming front and center and getting some headlines because of the former senator and Dr. Scott Jensen, who has been on our show before. These are the headlines that he's been making in some work that he's doing. Minnesota state lawmakers call for audit of COVID-19 death certificates. Minnesota lawmakers say coronavirus deaths could be inflated by 40% after reviewing death certificates. Minnesota senator, physician blows whistle, the bizarre non-COVID types of deaths being blamed on COVID. To get to the bottom of this, I am joined by really one of my heroes, Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Jensen, so what's this all about? Take me through it. Why did you, I know you were talking about how the death certificate and filling it out as a doctor had changed months ago. Where do we find ourselves now, and what are you trying to do about it?
Well, thank you, Dale, for having me on. It actually started back in April. And what happened was the Minnesota Department of Health emailed physicians in Minnesota a communication which linked to a CDC document as well. And what really changed was on a death certificate, there's 2 parts. Part 1, which is really the most important, and Part 2, where you can put contributing conditions. An example might be the most helpful. If I have a heart attack today and tomorrow I end up having an angiogram and a stent is placed, but too much muscle was killed in my heart attack, so that 2 months from now I develop congestive heart failure and I'm going, if you will, the wrong way, and a month later I develop severe pneumonia and I die. The death certificate in Part 1, the top line completed should be the immediate cause of death, and it would be pneumonia. And that would be due to or as a consequence of congestive heart failure, which was due to or a consequence of the heart attack, which was due to or a consequence of coronary artery disease. But it's that bottom line that's completed that's called the underlying cause of death. That's what we tabulate. That's what goes into the Federal Registrar of Disease. When we say that 3 million Americans die every year and 650,000 of them die of heart disease, it becomes, if you will, a conclusion that says 650,000 death certificates should have on the underlying cause of death line a cardiovascular diagnosis. Well, we found that in Minnesota, that if you look at the COVID-19 deaths, and at that time, the first time we looked, there were some 3,000. We said, okay, let's look. Real simple. Just look at the underlying cause of death line, which is the bottom line that's completed. It could be line A, B, C, or D. It's just got to be the bottom line. How many of those had COVID-19 or a COVID-19 related diagnosis on it? And right off the bat, we found that there were some 700 or 800 that did not have a COVID-19 diagnosis on it. If you look here on this graph in front of us, these are COVID deaths from the Department of Health. Yeah. If you look at the line that says negative 603 in the right margin, COVID was not on the underlying cause of death line. It might have been somewhere else, line 1, line 2, but it wasn't on the line. On the underlying cause of death line might have been congestive heart failure, drowning, motor vehicle accident, shotgun. In those situations, you can only die of one thing. You can't be listed twice in the Federal Registrar. So if I die of a heart attack, it's going to be a cardiovascular death. If I happen to, in my last 2 weeks of life, be detected with a COVID-19 test, that doesn't mean I died of it. Yes, you could say I died with it, but Deborah Birx said that can't happen. So what you would do with that, if you wanted to as a physician, you could put that in Part 2 under contributing condition. But again, back to last April, the Department of Health said, oh, by the way, if a contributing condition is COVID-19, don't put it as a contributing condition. Put it in Part 1 as a cause of death. But if it's something else like asthma or emphysema, for heaven's sakes, put it in Part 2. Relegate it to Part 2. So clearly, the dedication that we've demonstrated for the last several decades to precision and a sequence of causation was being thrown out the window. And the question was, why?
It's really, really something that has been staggering. Do you have an answer? I mean, are you moving towards a hypothesis or a theory on why?
Well, I think we have two things we have to look at, and they're not going to necessarily be any fun to talk about. But the first one is if you want to paralyze people's own ability to think for themselves and to stand up for themselves, frighten them, scare them so bad that they can't think straight. They're paralyzed. That's one way to control large groups of people. And I think we're seeing it. But the other thing that happens is you have to follow the money. At the time I first spoke up in April, I did not know that the amount of CARES Act dollars that would be distributed to hospitals and clinics would ultimately depend upon how many COVID-19 admissions a hospital might have. So what I've learned over the last few months is that if between January 1st and June 10th, a hospital was able to reach the threshold of 161 COVID-19 admissions, they would receive $77,000 per admission on top of what they'd already been paid.
Thank you for the question, Tom. I know a lot of people are asking similar questions at this time about death counts and the Italian mortality rate. Why is it off the charts? What's going on here? So let's break it down as much as we can with what is being reported and what isn't being widely reported. And we can take this even from fairly mainstream sources that are pointing out there are some deep and serious flaws in just taking these death numbers from Italy at face value. For example, The Telegraph, of all places, posted this article up about a week ago. Why have so many coronavirus patients died in Italy? And they were noting even at that time the discrepancy between the at least reported mortality rates between, say, Italy and China and Germany was quite large. Germany reporting a mortality rate at that time of about 0.4%, whereas Italy was hovering around 9%. Why is that? Well, as they go on to explain in this report, according to Professor Walter Ricciardi, scientific advisor to Italy's Minister of Health, the country's mortality rate is far higher due to demographics. The nation has the second oldest population worldwide, and the manner in which hospitals record deaths. The age of our patients in hospitals is substantially older. The median is 67, while in China it was 46, Professor Ricciardi says. So essentially the age distribution of our patients is squeezed to an older age, and this is substantial in increasing the lethality. And it goes on to state that a study in JAMA this week found that almost 40% of infections and 87% of deaths in the country have been in patients over 70 years old. And according to modelling by Imperial College London, the majority of this age group are likely to need critical hospital care, including 80% of 80-somethings, putting immense pressure on the health system. Well, more on the Imperial College London study in a bit, but let's continue diving into these Italian numbers and what that means. I want you to reflect on what was just reported in that article because it's important, but it has been reported and then swept under the rug and not really taken into account when we get these startling record number of deaths in Italy. They can't get coffins fast enough. Well, hold on a second. We get this, for example, from offguardian.org talking about this Italian mortality phenomenon. They have a post. Italy, only 12% of COVID-19 deaths list COVID-19 as cause. Report shows up to 88% of Italy's alleged COVID-19 deaths could be misattributed. And they talk about the report, citing Professor Walter Ricciardi, in which he says, the way in which we code deaths in our country is very generous, in the sense that all the people who die in hospitals with the coronavirus are deemed to be dying of the coronavirus. On re-evaluation by the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus, while 88% of patients who have died have at least one premorbidity, i.e. other type of disease. Many had 2 or 3. As Off Guardian notes, this has been reported widely. It was even in the Telegraph, and yet no one seems to be engaging with it. The president of the Italian Civil Protection Service actually went out of his way to remind people on the nature of Italy's fatality figures in a morning briefing on March 20th. I want you to remember these people died with the coronavirus and not from the coronavirus. What does this actually mean? It means that the Italian death toll figures could have been artificially inflated by up to 88%. If true, this would mean the total number of Italians who have actually died of COVID-19 could be as low as 700, which would bring Italy, currently a statistical outlier in terms of COVID-19 fatalities, well in line with the rest of the world. It means thousands of deaths currently widely attributed to COVID-19 and being used to justify the introduction of measures equating to medical martial law may not have died of COVID-19 at all, but of their serious chronic comorbidity, cancer, heart disease, etc. This statistic is not a secret or in any way controversial. It was in the Telegraph, after all. But people seem to be ignoring it or reading around it or perhaps simply not understanding it.
Can you talk about your concerns about deaths being misreported by coronavirus because of either testing or standards for how they're characterized?
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. And I think the reporting here has been pretty straightforward over the last 5 to 6 weeks. Prior to that, when there wasn't testing in January and February, that's a very different situation and unknown. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and I mean, the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Speaking of Minnesota, a doctor and state senator from Minnesota, Scott Jensen, joins us tonight on the 702 communication line to talk about an interesting piece you put in the Star Tribune recently as well. So I don't know if you like Dr. Jensen, Senator Jensen, but thank you so much for joining us.
As a physician, I received an email last week from the Department of Health coaching me on how to fill out death certificates. And I've never really received coaching from the Vital Statistics Agency in terms of how to do a death certificate. But basically, I felt like they were saying, you know, you don't have to have a confirmed laboratory test for COVID-19 in order to make the death certificate be COVID-19. So
Wait. Sir, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that what you just said, I think is critically important. Can you repeat what you just said, please?
Well, last Friday, I received a 7-page document that sort of told me that if I had an 86-year-old patient that had pneumonia but was never tested for COVID-19, but sometime after she came down with pneumonia, we learned that she had been exposed to her son who had no symptoms, but later on was identified with COVID-19, that it would be appropriate to diagnose on the death certificate COVID-19. Now, we've not done that. If someone has the pneumonia after and it's in the middle of a flu epidemic, and I don't have a test on influenza, I don't diagnose influenza on the death certificate. I will say this elderly patient died of pneumonia.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but my heart is sinking right now as you're telling me this. You're a doctor. Why in the world would they be sending you out information to fill out death certificates, whether the person's been diagnosed with COVID-19 or not, but then to say in the death certificate this person's death was caused by COVID-19? That does not sound right to me.
I went to the person in our office who does most of the death certificates over the last 10, 20 years, and I said, does this sound right? I had her look at the documents that I printed off, and she said, well, we've always been told that you always put down just facts. You don't put down any probabilities. You don't put any presumptions down. It's just what you know. And so this is concerning, and it actually gets to your point, Chris. When we start talking about the data that goes into the modeling, we have to ask ourselves a question. Are we being forthright? Are we sharing with the public? Minnesota, North Dakota, we don't need to be having it sugar-coated. We want to know what's going into your modeling.
So with that being said, why would they want to skew the number of deaths due to COVID-19?
Well, fear is a great way to control people, and I worry about that. I worry that sometimes we're so darn interested in just jazzing up the fear factor that, sometimes people's ability to think for themselves is paralyzed if they're frightened enough. And that's not where I want people to be. I want people to say, we're going to get through this. I'm going to use my head. I'm going to go to different sources. I'm going to listen to different sources. And I'm going to think for myself, because that's what America's about.
Senator, if you don't mind, after this interview, if you can send me that 7-page document, and just for clarity, you were sent a 7-page document by who again?
The Department of Health.
Department of Health, saying, hey, fill this out, whether they test positive for COVID. That is stunning, sir.
A Minnesota state senator says officials are asking doctors to fill out death certificates with diagnosis of COVID-19, whether the person died of it or not. Valley News Team's Callie Hubbard talked to the lawmaker today, who says fear may be coming into play.
Minnesota Senator and Dr. Scott Jensen says he received a 7-page document from the Minnesota Department of Health on how doctors should go about filling out a cause of death certificate. The letter from the Minnesota Department of Health gives advice to physicians, physician assistants, and others who certify deaths. The doctor says the letter takes you to a CDC website that has recommendations on how to include COVID-19 as a diagnosis for someone who was never tested for COVID-19. Dr. Jensen says each state's reported death numbers are making a lot of people fearful, adding that getting the number right is critical, especially during a pandemic.
I worry that sometimes we're so darn interested in just jazzing up the fear factor that sometimes people's ability to think for themselves is paralyzed if they're frightened enough.
My next guest is a doctor and state senator in Minnesota who is deeply troubled by the CDC's latest guidance for counting COVID deaths. Dr. Scott Jensen joins me now. Doctor, I want to read for our viewers what the CDC says in part about how to count COVID deaths relating to that last issue we just raised. In cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID cannot be made, but is suspected or likely, like the circumstances are compelling with a reasonable degree of certainty, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. So, doctor, what's the problem with that?
Well, in short, it's ridiculous. I spent some time earlier today just going through the CDC's manual on how to complete death certificates and the parts that were specifically written for physicians. And in that manual, it talks of precision and specificity, and that's what we were trained with. The determination of the cause of death is a big deal. It has impact on estate planning. It has impact on future generations. And the idea that we're going to allow people to massage and sort of game the numbers is a real issue, because we're going to undermine the trust. And right now, as we see politicians doing things that aren't necessarily motivated on fact and science, the public's their trust in politicians is already wearing thin.
And doctor, in that same CDC guidance sheet on COVID-19, it references the fact that basically this is a judgment call for doctors on how to fit. I read it, what goes on line 1, and then what goes on line 2, and what goes on the final line as far as contributing factors and ultimate cause of death. But they concede that it is a judgment call. Again, why is that not correct?
Well, let's just take influenza. If I have a patient died a month ago, had fever, cough, and died after 3 days, and maybe had been an elderly, fragile individual, and there happened to be an influenza epidemic around our community, I wouldn't put influenza on the death certificate, and I've never been encouraged to do so. I would put probably respiratory arrest would be the top line, and the underlying cause of disease would be pneumonia, and in the contributing factors, I might well put emphysema or congestive heart failure. But I would never put influenza down as the underlying cause of death, and yet that's what we're being asked to do here.
Dr. Fauci was asked about the COVID death count today. Here's what he said in part.
What do you say to those folks who are making the claim without really any evidence that these deaths are being padded, that the number of COVID-19 deaths are being padded? For example, somebody who might die from a number of factors but had coronavirus are being listed as coronavirus deaths, and because of that, the number is being inflated.
You know, having been through other serious issues, particularly the very painful early years of HIV, AIDS, when people talk about conspiracy theories, you will always have conspiracy theories when you have very challenging public health crises. They are nothing but distractions. You know, I can assure you we have so much to do to protect the health and the welfare of the American people that I would just hope we just put those conspiracy stuff and let somebody write a book about it later on, but not now.
Conspiracy theories, doctor? So you're engaging in conspiracy theories. What do you say to Dr. Fauci tonight?
Well, I would remind him that anytime healthcare intersects with dollars, it gets awkward. Right now, Medicare has determined that if you have a COVID-19 admission to the hospital, you'll get paid $13,000. If that COVID-19 patient goes on a ventilator, you get $39,000, 3 times as much. Nobody can tell me after 35 years in the world of medicine that sometimes those kinds of things impact on what we do. Some physicians really have a bent towards public health, and they will put down influenza or whatever because that's their preference. I try to stay very specific, very precise. If I know I've got pneumonia, that's what's going on the death certificate. I'm not going to add stuff just because it's convenient. I think that it's not a conspiracy theory at all.
You reject what he said.
Absolutely. I mean, let's just take someone getting hit by a bus and they collapse along and they go into the emergency room and they're there for 15, 20 minutes. Blood work comes back, COVID test comes back positive, and they die 20 minutes later because of their collapsed lung. We're going to put that down as COVID-19? That doesn't make any sense.
There was a reporter on the line because of our conversation, and you were on the Laura Ingraham show last night, and you had alluded to maybe there was some financial purposes or financial reasons to inflate the COVID-19 deaths. She just said at the end of that conversation there that I played for our audience, there's no policy and no politics that would cause anyone to want to inflate those numbers. What say you?
Again, buy into that. I think we're going to have hospitals shut down and potentially never open their doors again. This is serious business. We might have the big metropolitan healthcare systems getting big chunks of money from the feds, but the bottom line is your outer ring hospitals and your hospitals out in Minnesota that aren't critical access, they're at risk. So I think that I would rather have people draw their own conclusions. Let me just say this. If I admit a patient to the hospital and they're on Medicare and they have just routine pneumonia for a diagnosis, the hospital will get a lump sum payment called a DRG, and it'll be about $4,600. If I admit that same patient and I attach COVID-19 to the pneumonia diagnosis, then it goes from $4,600 to $13,000 for that admission, regardless of whether the patient's in a hospital for 3 days or 13 days. If during that hospitalization, I put the patient on a ventilator for a period of time, then the payment goes from $13,000 to $39,000. Now that's a big payment. You're not going to see many outstate hospitals get access to those kind of dollars.
Illinois' virus-related death toll continues to climb. The director of public health took time today to explain how the department rules someone an actual COVID death. It can be a little confusing. She says anyone who has COVID when they pass away will be included in that category. Dr. Ngozi Ezike explained this does not mean the virus caused that death, but if someone does test positive for COVID before dying, that is classified a coronavirus fatality.
I just want to be clear in terms of the definition of people dying of COVID. So the case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death.
So when I started looking at all these deaths happening, not only in China, but also in Italy, I then ask a basic question, a reasonable question. What actual analysis are they doing? What serological examinations? How are they determining these people actually died from the coronavirus and not with the coronavirus? And when I finally got data, I found out this was the most polluted area of Europe, that this is an area notorious for retirement and for nursing homes. And these people had already lived their maximum lifespan. Many of them were already in some form of assisted living or nursing home environment. And these are people who had at least 2 and 3 comorbidities, end-stage emphysema, congestive heart failure, cancers, etc. So then when a doctor there started to do an honest examination, he found out that death certificates were being signed without a full examination to determine did they actually even have the coronavirus and not just some symptoms. And so we didn't have actual good data. Then they were just using the PCR test. And I happen to know from the founder of the PCR, Kerry Mullis, who was a friend of mine. He won the Nobel Prize in 1986 for discovering the PCR. He said, what it shouldn't be used for. And this is one of the things that you shouldn't use it. Just take the test, and if you have the coronavirus, it's going to show it, and therefore we know.
PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
And then we found out that the mortality rates were not being honestly calculated in the United States in particular. Anybody dying of anything, it would end up being COVID. And then there was an undercover investigation, found out that every funeral home they were calling, the people weren't even getting any autopsy reports, or they were just saying COVID, COVID, COVID for everything. So then we started seeing that 35 to 50% of the people dying were dying in nursing homes. Why weren't we giving the credit to the disease that they were there dying from instead of COVID? So all this really confused a lot of people, and yet they got away with it. Now they're rushing into a vaccine.
Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com, and an interview that is being recorded on the 15th of June, 2020. And today we have a new guest on the program, Rosemary Frey, who came to my attention via some reports of hers that are being published at off-guardian.org, which I'm sure many of my listeners will be familiar with, so perhaps you've seen it already. Today we're going to be talking specifically about one of her recent articles on were conditions for high death rates at care homes created on purpose. And in this case, you're talking specifically about the conditions created in Ontario, but obviously they do pertain, I think, broadly to a lot of the same conditions that were created around North America and in Europe, including in the UK. You list in this article 3 particular conditions that you note were contributory factors to the high death rates that have pertained in care homes over the course of this crisis, ? Condition set 1, broad definition of novel coronavirus infections and outbreaks. Condition set 2, hospital care rationing guidelines. And condition set 3, new rules surrounding death certificates and removal and disposition of bodies. So let's start going through that list. Let's let people know about some of these conditions. How and when and by whom were they created?
Sure, James, I'd be happy to. So the first condition is the very broad definition of COVID and of an infection with a novel coronavirus. And this, as you said, does apply in many other places. I was just looking at the conditions in the UK from the Geriatric Society there, and you can have the sniffles and you're deemed to have COVID. And here it's a little more, smaller, more narrow definition. You can have sniffles and a cough, and then you've got COVID. So these were set right from the beginning of the pandemic. At least in Ontario, they said that anybody, if in a long-term care home specifically, or in a congregate setting for seniors, one person could have one symptom, and then the whole long-term care home would be deemed to be an outbreak, and anybody else who got any sort of symptom was deemed to have COVID. So that means that they've just opened up the door to an outbreak. Anybody who has any symptom is deemed to have COVID. So if they die, they're therefore also deemed to have COVID. And what we usually should see, though, is a narrowing of the definition, so you can really be sure these people had that condition.
I think this question is probably for Minister Elliott, actually. I know you've taken questions before about how we include positive COVID-19 cases and deaths, but with regards to the one that we unfortunately just read about, the young girl, the word from Toronto Public Health is that she died of health complications unrelated to COVID-19, but did test positive. So I'm just curious if you want to reiterate why that is being categorized. If it's unrelated to the COVID-19 positive, why it's being listed anyway.
In some cases, I'm not saying specifically with respect to this case, but in some cases there are situations where there are other pre-existing conditions that may actually be the cause of the loss rather than COVID. COVID is there, but may not have been the cause of death.
Hello everyone, it is the 22nd of June 2020. My name is Anna Brees and I'm about to do an interview with Paul Hickey. He is 39 years old, he lives in northwest Manchester, and he sent me an email about a story that I felt that we should share with the people on this channel and with other individuals across the social media platforms about something that he got involved with in relation to the death of a contact of one of your friends. And we're only going to call this individual Farid, and it's a call that was recorded without the person knowing in the coroner's office. This particular individual, he was in his late 20s, I believe. He was fine the day before, wasn't showing any signs of symptoms that you're aware of. He was found the next day. He'd had an expanded chest, and was frothing at the mouth. So it seemed that the death was sudden rather than any kind of long-term symptoms of coronavirus or COVID-19. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. So he'd been basically celebrating Ramadan with my friend, and they have been seeing each other every day in the evening time. And so he was seen on a Friday evening. He went home that evening, and no one could get hold of him then throughout the rest of the next day on the Saturday. And so my friend went round and discovered the body. So he may have died on that Friday evening and not been discovered for 24 hours. We're not sure. But certainly he was seen every day through Ramadan. They've been spending time together, and there were no symptoms present. And my friend was adamant that he seemed well and healthy and had no symptoms.
So like I say, we're just awaiting that result coming back, which will be, once that comes back, if it's deemed a positive result, then what the mortuary staff will do is come back to ourselves just to let us know that, and they will record the death as being COVID-19.
See, now that is odd to me because it didn't seem like a COVID death apparently at the time.
I think they're swabbing everybody who goes into that hospital.
Yeah, I understand that, but people die of lots of things.
Exactly.
People have viruses in their bodies, all sorts of things going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone has died of COVID just because...
Yeah, no, I fully understand. And if it comes back negative, the post-mortem would be carried out.
So if it comes back positive, they won't carry out a post-mortem, they'll just label it as a COVID death and then we can all move on?
Correct.
Right, okay. Okay, yeah. Thanks for letting me know.
Unfortunately, Mr. Hickey, that's the way that things are being dealt with at the moment, and it's not quite right. No, it's not, because, some people, as you say, they may be symptomatic of COVID, but it might not be COVID. At the moment, I've got a streaming nose, indicative of a cold, but it's not, it's hay fever.
Right.
So I can understand where families are coming from when they're like, well, how do we know it was definitely COVID? But it's because they are swabbed and they come back as positive for the coronavirus. And that is the only thing that they check for when they do the swab, is for the corona.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for getting in touch with me later in the day.
No problem. I'll give you a contact call tomorrow, hopefully advising that we've had the results through.
All right. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks very much for calling, Paul. Take care.
A Minnesota state senator who's also a physician says he's being investigated by the state medical board. And as John Croman tells us, it's not about direct patient care. John?
Yes, Senator Scott Jensen told us that the letter that he got from the state medical board says that the complaints are based on things he said as a senator, criticizing the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
We will have more than 50 million Americans have flu this year.
Senator Scott Jensen is a skeptic of the government's COVID-19 response.
We didn't shut the country down.
Now Jensen, who's also a physician, believes he's being targeted for exercising free speech after receiving a letter from the State Board of Medical Practices that the board is investigating 2 complaints against him.
Do I feel targeted? Yeah, I do. Do I know who my accusers are? No, I don't get to know.
The Chaska Republican revealed the probe on Facebook in a video that's been viewed 4 million times.
It's sort of weaponizing the licensing board, saying, we're going to do whatever we can to muzzle you, and we don't like what you're saying.
A Minnesota law gives a long list of ways doctors can run afoul of the licensing board, but the letter focused on Section G, which includes deceiving and defrauding the public. Specifically, an April appearance on a Fargo TV show in which Jensen questioned guidance from the state about how to list COVID as a cause of death. And another more generic complaint about just comparing COVID-19 to the flu.
They didn't agree with me. They didn't like it, that I was trying to provide some context for the flu, for COVID-19. We've had some 35,000, 40,000 cases of COVID-19 in Minnesota thus far. According to the Department of Health people, that might translate into 10 times that many. And if it does translate into 10 times that many, that's 350,000 cases. But in 2018, we had more than 500,000 Minnesotans with the flu. When I say that, am I recklessly giving you advice regarding COVID-19 and the flu? Dr. Anthony Fauci has come out and compared them all the time. Dr. Mike Osterholm has. Dr. Fauci, when he talks about influenza, he was the lead article in this New England Journal article, and he said this: if one assumes that the number of asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic cases for COVID-19 is several times as high as the number of reported cases, the case fatality rate may be considerably less than 1%.
This suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza. That's Dr. Fauci. And, oh, by the way, one of the contributing authors was Dr. Robert Redfield, the head of the CDC. Dr. Osterholm is a well-regarded epidemiologist. And he was saying this in the middle of March. He said, "The flu has become a pandemic more than once and has killed millions of people. It still exists today. Unfortunately, we now have on our hands something else, but it's caused by a coronavirus, which is acting very much like influenza." I've got the Department of Health in Illinois, where one of the directors says that just because we put COVID-19 down on the death certificate as cause of death, that doesn't mean the patient died of COVID-19. She said that. I just want to leave you with a couple of questions you could maybe ask yourself. Do we think it's okay for physicians to certify in death certificates that someone died of COVID-19, even if there was never a COVID-19 positive test obtained, even if there was never a COVID-19 test done, even if a COVID-19 test hadn't even been considered? And maybe the worst even if the family had no clue that the death certificate they received for their loved one was going to say COVID-19.
A man dies in a motorcycle crash, but his death listed as a coronavirus death.
Fox 35 News investigating. We dug through the data, and then we asked the questions. Fox 35's Danielle Lama joins us live from Orange County tonight. Danielle, how are officials explaining this?
Well, Charles, they really haven't given us much of an explanation at this point. The way we found out is I was asking the county health officer about 2 coronavirus deaths involving people in their 20s and whether they had any underlying conditions. Then one of his answers surprised us.
The first one didn't have any. He died in a motorcycle accident.
New questions tonight about the accuracy of the state's coronavirus death numbers. Orange County Health Officer Dr. Raul Pino telling us one person reported to have died from COVID was killed in a motorcycle accident. So was it removed from the data?
I don't think so. I have to double check. We were arguing. We were discussing and trying to argue with the state, not because of the numbers. I mean, it's 100. It's not make any difference if it's 99. Yeah. But the validity that the fact that the individual didn't die from COVID-19, died in a crash. But you can actually argue that it could have been the COVID-19 that caused him to crash. So I don't know the conclusion of that one.
We looked into it, and there are still 2 people in their 20s on Orange County's data list for COVID deaths. So is this a contradiction to how the state says it's counting deaths? The Florida Department of Health sending Fox 35 a statement saying a COVID death is determined if COVID-19 is listed as the immediate or underlying cause of death or listed as one of the significant conditions contributing to death, or if there's a confirmed COVID-19 infection from a lab test and the cause of death doesn't meet exclusion criteria like trauma, suicide, homicide, overdose, motor vehicle accident, etc.
The only thing that I could say to people is that the data that I'm providing you with is the data that we consume from the state, and we are offering you to the best data that we have.
And Dr. Pino tells us that the medical examiner's office has to sign off on all COVID-19 deaths. We also reached out to that office and have not heard back. Reporting live in Orlando, Danielle Lama, Fox 35 News. Of course, a lot of questions about how a motorcycle accident may have ended up in that state data. And, you know, a lot is riding on these numbers, and people want to make sure that these are accurate. There are big decisions, schools, governments making decisions looking at the data. So that's why we're asking these questions when we hear something like this.
No, you're 100%. I mean, we're making public health decisions. We're making decisions that have economic consequences as well, mental health consequences. So, Danielle, stay on it. We appreciate your reporting.
Health Secretary Matt Hancock has ordered an urgent review into how Public Health England calculates the daily death figures from coronavirus. Well, let's get more from Sky's Rob Powell, who is in Downing Street this morning. What's this all about, Rob?
So this is about how Public Health England calculates who has died from coronavirus and whose deaths get added on to that tally that we've grown used to seeing day by day, that currently stands at around 45,000. Now, the issue is that the way it's being counted at the moment means that if you are diagnosed, you test positive for coronavirus, even if you go into hospital, but then you recover and you come out, and then 2 months later, say, or a period of time later, you then die of something completely unrelated to coronavirus, your death will still be added to that coronavirus death tally. So the example that was given to me by a government source was basically if you had tested positive in February for coronavirus, you'd recovered, you'd been fine for the last few months, but then you'd been hit by a lorry or hit by a bus yesterday and died, your death would still be added on to that coronavirus tally, even though clearly, even though you may have had it, clearly your death is nothing to do with coronavirus at all. So essentially what this means is that tally that we've been used to getting from the government every day when they are updating us on death figures is likely to be out, is likely to be too high, which means that 45,000 figure that we are currently looking at in terms of deaths from coronavirus is likely to be wrong. Now, this doesn't affect when you're looking at excess deaths, a different way of counting deaths, and this doesn't affect the data that we get from the ONS. There's a couple of different sources of data for coronavirus deaths. The ONS figures are likely to still be accurate, but in terms of the actual count that Public Health England and the government rely on, well, that now looks to be inflated. So this urgent review has been ordered by the Health Secretary to basically try and sort out this issue and to try and establish actually by how much they have been overcounting their deaths. Hugely embarrassing for the government, especially after some of the ordeals that we've seen in terms of counting test data. It now seems that arguably the most crucial figure in this whole coronavirus pandemic, how many people have actually died from the virus, the government's own figures could be way out.
Hi and welcome. This is Lockdown TV from Unheard. So earlier this week, we recorded a wide-ranging discussion with Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine and his colleague Tom Jefferson, covering all sorts of aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we will be publishing that shortly. But yesterday evening, news broke of a discovery that Professor Hennigan had made in the statistics, so we thought we'd quickly catch up with him and hear about that beforehand. Professor Hennigan, thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
So this concerns deaths and the numbers of deaths that are attributed to COVID-19. And this matters because that daily total that is announced for deaths in England affects the whole atmosphere. It affects whether people think that the pandemic is coming to an end or not. It even affects politics. For example, it's referred to by Nicola Sturgeon and neighbouring countries as to what border arrangements should be. You've discovered that daily death total may not actually correlate to people dying from COVID-19. Tell us about that.
Yeah, one of the things about England and particularly UK is it's quite confusing when you look at the different ways deaths are reported. You've got Office for National Statistics, you've got Public Health England, and then you've got NHS England. Then you've got the 4 devolved nations who all do slightly different things, so it's very confusing. But one of the things that we noticed is Public Health England creates lots of confusion because one day, for instance, on the 6th of July, they'll report 16 deaths, and then the next day, there'll be 152 deaths. And at that point, the media takes a notice, starts to get concerned, and you see these reports of hundreds of deaths per day. So what we did is go back and look at the Office for National Statistics, who report the deaths who are registered. So when you go to register your death, that death certificate is then centrally registered. So they're very accurate about the day they occurred. And what we noticed, if you go back, for instance, to the 30th of June, the PHE figures, Public Health England, are about double the ONS figures. So we ask questions of what's going on here. And what we noticed is, if you look at the way PHE does their reporting, they are reporting anybody who has had a test positive for COVID in the past. Therefore, a death reported today could have occurred in early March. It may not even be related, but the way they're recording it, it assumes that people are thinking, oh, there are over 100 deaths today. Things are getting worse. Now, it's interesting in the devolved nations like Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Could I just so I really understand this. So if an individual patient had COVID-19 in March,
correct,
recovered completely, was subsequently tested negative, and then died in a nursing home 2 months later, that would then be recorded as a COVID-19 death.
That is what we assume is happening from Public Health England, and that's where the disparity is coming from, the wide variation. Interestingly, if you look at Scotland and Northern Ireland, they have a sort of 28-day cut-off period. And that's exactly what we're asking for. What you really want to know is, what are the deaths occurring in the context of an actual test that has occurred, a positive test in the last 28 days? And then you can understand the trends, what's happening. And okay, it's okay to report the historical deaths, but actually they don't help us understand what's happening now. Now, this will get increasingly confusing as we go into the next winter, because you could have a new outbreak, new deaths, but you're also reporting historical deaths. We may not see that trend in the way that they're currently reporting this.
So you mean if someone had COVID-19 now, recovers, and then dies of something completely unrelated next year, yes, that would still be recorded as a COVID-19 death in the current system?
Yeah, and that's why we're saying it looks like you can never recover under the current system, because you could die of influenza, for instance, in January next year, but because you had a positive COVID test, you'd still appear in the figures.
The test is not to be trusted. Everything they're telling you about, cases, admissions, people in ICU and deaths, all pivot off this PCR test. People saying the R number. The R number depends on the PCR test, which I'm telling you is unreliable. More COVID patients going into hospital depends on the PCR test, which I'm saying is unreliable. Even the people operating it could not stand in front of you and say what percentage of the positives are genuine.
When we see these stark figures and they're reported in very sort of ponderous tones on the television, we've had 500 more deaths or 400, whatever it is on any given day.
Taking the total number across the UK to 41,759.
Often, actually, if you dig into it, you look at actually over the days in which they've actually been, the date of death as opposed to reported death, actually we're looking at far lower numbers. But also these are deaths with COVID, not of COVID. So you can be in hospital for a whole variety of other reasons. You can have heart disease, you can have cancer. If you test positive for COVID, you still end up on these statistics, don't you?
And see, this is what I'm saying. Everything you're being told, every scary fact and prediction from Whitty and Valence, all hangs off the PCR test, which they have admitted they cannot tell what percentage of positives are false.
When I read your analysis yesterday, the reason my heart sank, because I thought, if we can't even trust the death numbers that are coming out from Public Health England every day, it's going to make conspiracy theorists of us all in the end, because it seems like the tilt on all of these things, if there is room for error, and of course it's difficult, it always seems to tilt in the direction of making the numbers look worse rather than look better. We haven't had these kind of ambiguities in the other direction so much, and it gives the impression that the structures are all pointing in one way. I mean, do you feel that?
Yeah, so that's an important issue that's going on in the media. You'll always hear about the catastrophe and the consequences of that. One of the things we notice is when you don't hear about something, there's probably good news happening. So when Sweden looks worse, you hear about it. But when it's not so bad, like now, you never see it in the media.
A 90-year-old man who fell and died from complications of a hip fracture. A 60-year-old man dead from a gunshot wound to the head. These are some of the deaths in Palm Beach County recently and incorrectly labeled as COVID deaths in medical examiner records. The I-Team reviewed a copy of the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's COVID death spreadsheet. It has 581 deaths listed. All of them tested positive for COVID-19. But CBS 12 News noticed 8 cases in which the person died of something completely different, like Parkinson's or a neck fracture, and COVID was not listed as the cause of death. We wanted to know why they were still being listed as a coronavirus fatality.
I think it's completely misleading.
Rachel Eade has the same questions. She's a Palm Beach County resident reviewing the ME's records, and she found out of all of these cases, just 169 were listed as COVID-19 infections without any contributing illnesses. She thinks all of the others should be reported with more context, like comorbidities.
I understand that maybe they want to be safe in counting those numbers initially, but we are 4 or 5 months in, we have more information and we have that data. We need to remove the COVID cases that are not exclusive COVID, and we need to be giving people that information.
Governor DeSantis on Fox News this morning said after an Orange County motorcycle crash was recorded as a COVID death, Florida's fatality count needs another review.
I think the public, when they see the fatality figures, they want to know who died because they caught COVID. If you're just in a car accident, and we've had other instances in which it just was no real relationship that has been counted. So we want to look at that and see, how pervasive that issue is as well.
We took our investigation to the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office. Their operations manager took a look at the cases that we flagged and admitted they were errors. He says the staff is working to remove the erroneous deaths and says we should see an update in the next report that they release tomorrow. In West Palm Beach, Danielle Wass, CBS 12 News.
So perspective, to me, is something we always need to consider. One of the things that concerns me also is I wish that Admiral Guar was here yet. I asked this question of him last time was here, and we didn't have enough time to continue our discussion on it with regards to the sort of perverse incentive for the medical folks to claim that somebody died of COVID versus if it's an automobile accident, for instance, as long as you have COVID in your system, you get to claim it as a COVID death, in which means you get to get more money as the attending physician, hospital, whatever. And he acknowledged that the statistics he's getting from the states are overinflated. We found that the governor of Colorado, who is a Democrat, actually did a research on this and found he had to get rid of 12% of the deaths that were recorded in state. Dr. Redfield, would you like to comment on that a little bit about the perverse incentive, and is there an effort to try and do something different in the way that these deaths are recorded so we actually have better records and better numbers, better data to go with?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you're correct in that we've seen this in other disease processes too. Early in the HIV epidemic, somebody may have a heart attack but also have HIV. The hospital would prefer the DRG for HIV because there's greater reimbursement. So I do think there's some reality to that.
What I want to share isn't a conspiracy. It's not a theory. It's a fact. And this is happening. This has happened to my family, and this can potentially happen to a lot of other families out there. So what happened was my uncle, he was 72 years old, his name was Errol, and he had terminal cancer. He's been sick for quite a number of years, and he's been living in a nursing home. And as you can imagine, terminal cancer means what exactly? It means you're dying of cancer. My mother was notified that he was passing away. She went and saw him on August 11th. And what happened was that 3 hours, it was about 3 or 4 hours after this happened, she received a phone call, because obviously she said
after he passed,
after he passed, received a phone call, and the doctor was talking about the death certificate. My uncle contracted COVID-19, so he had a PCR test. So August 7th was a positive test. He passed away on August 11th. So keep that in mind. There was 4 days between contracting the virus and passing away. As you can imagine, 4 days isn't a long time. He was in palliative care. For everyone listening, he was in palliative care for 6 weeks before he passed away. So this is obviously a long-term pre-existing condition. This isn't something that just popped out of nowhere. He's been sick for a long time. He's had cancer, and he has a number of other pre-existing conditions. I want to make that very clear.
Yeah.
So the doctor was talking to my mother and suggested that the primary cause of death, so the number one cause of death, was COVID-19. The test came back positive on August 7th, and my uncle actually was, the nursing home actually said he was asymptomatic. So I want to make it clear that, isn't it interesting that someone that is asymptomatic, that has had lung cancer, which is a serious respiratory issue, was asymptomatic to COVID-19. So asymptomatic, meaning no problems. He has obviously had pre-existing conditions, meaning lung cancer. And the interesting part about this was that the doctor suggested that my mother would agree to having COVID-19 as a primary cause of death on the death certificate, meaning listed as number 1, meaning the main contributor, meaning that everything else didn't matter. It didn't matter that he had lung cancer. It didn't matter that he had even heart issues and all these other conditions that I can list off, which I won't get into detail about. And just think about this for a second. How would you feel if your mother or your sister or anyone that's going through this, and 3 hours after he passes away, you're getting a phone call from a doctor and that wants to talk about COVID-19? As my mum was disputing the death certificate, as you can imagine, she was emotional and she was confused, which anyone would be in that situation. Because this is only a few hours after he passed away, and this is just 2 days after, obviously, he passed away. So today's the 13th, he passed away on the 11th. My mum actually asked, and this is on the recording, I don't understand why this is happening. He passed away from lung cancer, and if they're going to list COVID, like what's the sort of agenda? And my mother actually asked the doctor.
The example's great.
The example, which was interesting, and she said, if this was a car accident, if there was a car accident and someone had COVID, would that be listed on the death certificate? Right, everyone? Would that be listed on the death certificate? And the answer was yes. And that is on recording, and that's why we're going to court, and that's why we're going to fight for all you guys. And it's not just about me and my family, because obviously my mother's upset, and I'm supporting my mum, my family, and everyone else that's involved, and really pushing this forward for all Australians. And it's important to let you guys know what's going on, and it's not okay. And I'm the type of person that's not going to put up with anything like this. I'm not going to accept it, and I certainly wouldn't expect any of you guys to accept this anyway.
Hospitals have been counting patients who died from serious pre-existing conditions as COVID-19 deaths. One America's Pearson Sharp has more, as the CDC counts over 51,000 patients who died from heart attacks as opposed to coronavirus.
The Centers for Disease Control have updated their death counts for coronavirus and reveal yet again that COVID-19 is rarely the actual cause of death among coronavirus patients. According to the CDC themselves, of the 220,000 deaths attributed to the coronavirus, 87,000 of them died from pneumonia and influenza. Another 17,000 died from chronic respiratory diseases, and 26,000 died from respiratory distress syndrome. 44,000 patients died from hypertensive diseases, 23,000 died from heart disease, and a whopping 28,000 died from cardiac arrest and heart failure. Yet all of these, even patients who died from heart attacks, were marked down as dying from the coronavirus. Doctors who spoke with One American News explained that 131,000 patients who are being considered COVID-19 deaths already had life-ending diseases, including cancer, dementia, and even end-stage renal failure. And according to the CDC, again, if you look at place of death, you'll see that some 10,000 patients who died from COVID were on hospice care, meaning they were terminally ill to begin with and were already expected to die. Doctors tell One American News that all of these patients were critically ill and likely died from their pre-existing conditions without any help from the coronavirus. However, they explain that the CARES Act, passed by Congress in March, gives hospitals a 20% bonus on their diagnosis-related group paid for by Medicare. Essentially, that means doctors are being paid to list deaths as coronavirus without any indication the patient's death was actually COVID-related.
But we're hearing now tonight there's more scrutiny about just what qualifies as a COVID-19 death, as we have passed another very difficult milestone.
Well, last month, the CDC released figures showing the vast majority of people who were listed as dying from COVID-19, 94% of them had other morbidity conditions, on average 2 to 3 other potential causes of death. Now we have numbers from Milwaukee County that may be even more startling. As of this past Sunday, 410 out of the 422 deaths there attributed to COVID-19 occurred in patients with other underlying potentially deadly health conditions. That's 97%. Suffering from diabetes, heart disease, leukemia, colon and prostate cancer, and more. Most had 2 to 3 conditions. Some had 5 or 6 serious illnesses, but all of them were listed as COVID-19 deaths. Even if they weren't tested for the coronavirus, if they had symptoms, that was their listed cause of death. And COVID was never named a secondary cause or cause other. It was always the primary cause. Here's one example. Cause A, coronavirus. Cause other, heart failure, diabetes, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, renal failure. Remember, that's one patient. But in Milwaukee, per the medical examiner, every person who dies with COVID-19 dies from COVID-19, no matter how sick they already were. Shannon?
Rick, did you say people who weren't even tested for COVID-19 had that listed as their cause of death?
If the doctors thought they had symptoms of COVID, they listed COVID as the cause of death.
Okay, very interesting report, Rick. Thank you very much for digging into that.
What was reported on August 23rd was 161,392 fatalities caused by COVID-19.
This morning, deaths from coronavirus in the United States have surpassed 160,000.
Okay, and this is just to repeat, you said it, but I just want to make it clear. This is August 23rd.
Correct.
So a few months ago.
A few months ago, correct. Had around the country, we used the guidelines from 2003 that the CDC published. These guidelines come from the CDC. So why we are creating a new set of guidelines for COVID-19 is beyond me. These have been working fine.
Well, we're going to talk about why that's the case, because I'm sure you and I both have some suspicions.
Yeah, we have suspicions for sure. And but by comparison, so using the new rules from March 24th, 161,392 fatalities as of August 23rd. Had we used the 2003 guidelines, our estimates are that we would have roughly 9,684 total fatalities due to COVID-19. That's a significant difference. That's a difference on the scale of really as much as 96%. The range that we came up with and calculated, Dr. Mercola, was 88.9% to 96% inflation.
Senator Scott Jensen. And I'm with Representative Mary Franson. And we're going to do today a little bit of a dangerous video. I sort of got myself in hot water way back in April when I made the comment that I was, as a physician, being encouraged to do death certificates differently with COVID-19 than other disease entities. For 17 years, the CDC document that guides us as physicians to do death certificates has stood. But this year we were told through the Department of Health and the CDC that the rules were changing if COVID-19 was involved. If it was asthma or emphysema, follow the standard rules. But if COVID-19, then not. I have always held that my job in completing a death certificate is identifying the initiating event that began the train of events that led to a person's demise. But if it's COVID-19, we're told now, it doesn't matter if it was actually the diagnosis that caused death. If someone had it, they died of it. You don't die with it, said Deborah Birx, you die of it. In the same way, if it's a contributing condition, it's a part or a cause of death. Generally, a contributing condition, say diabetes, in maybe a person with heart disease, it would be a contributing condition. It would not be in that sequence of events. So once again, we're going to talk about death certificates. It's really important to note this. Death certificates have very little, if none, in terms of an impact regarding payment to physicians or hospitals. Physicians and hospitals will pay attention to diagnoses on the discharge summary from the emergency room or from the hospital. But when we're talking death certificates, we are not talking about payment reimbursement or incentivized. We are talking about death certificates and how that impacts our total deaths and how that impacts on our, if you will, policies that the governors around this country have put in place because they use the death certificate data to drive the program. If I am perfectly healthy and tomorrow I get COVID-19 and I die of it, that would be simply a one line on that death certificate. I don't have any underlying conditions. Nothing preceded it. Nothing else initiated it. I got COVID-19 and I died. So you'd have one line, immediate cause of death. That would be the same as the underlying cause of death. So the underlying cause of death is really important. And you did fantastic work in terms of identifying the underlying cause of death. We looked at 2,800 death certificate data points. But of those, what we found was that 2,000 of them had COVID-19 as the underlying cause of death, but 800 did not. That would mean that we've had the number inflated by 40%. But I think what you found was so interesting was for those COVID-19 deaths that have been tabulated in the Department of Health statistics, when it wasn't the underlying cause of death, what was the underlying cause of death that still might have been called a COVID death?
Sure, that's a great question. So I have some examples here, and I was shocked, Scott, to find this. Seriously shocked. So we have an auto accident. The passenger was ejected from the vehicle, but there was COVID in the system, so therefore it counted as a COVID death. I have other examples where COVID isn't the underlying cause of death, where we have a fall. Another example of we have a freshwater drowning. We have dementia. We have a stroke and multi-organ failure.
The CDC wants accuracy on the death certificates. And what Representative Franson has uncovered is not quibbling. We are not trying to be political. We are just trying to follow facts. These facts you got didn't come from some secret treasure trove. This came from the Department of Health.
Which that information is public data. Anybody can request that data.
In the Annals of Epidemiology recently, they came out with an article and they said some countries have attributed COVID-19 as a death with only confirmed cases, confirmed tests. Others haven't needed a test. Moreover, some countries have included COVID-19 when COVID-19 was assumed to be the death cause, but we were never told what the assumption was based on. So this isn't just a Minnesota problem or a U.S. problem. This is globally. Mm-hmm. I've had doctors from United Kingdom, European countries call and talk to me about that. These are hard times, Mary. I know I'm not going to be in the Senate next year, but you are going to be in the House, and all of Minnesota is going to be literally relying on your willingness to call out the hard facts. I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you do and what you're going to be doing in the next 6 months.
Well, finding the information isn't the hard part. What's hard right now is to see the people of Minnesota and all over the world suffer under COVID-19 with the lockdowns, the restrictions, their loss of their liberties, where I just want sunlight on the issue. I want people to have the truth so that they can make their own informed decisions on how they want to live with their life, instead of government saying, this is how we feel you need to live your life. And if you don't live your life the way government says so, well, we've got a jail cell for you. That's not living.
Mary, when we get on the other side of this COVID-19 thing, and we get the auditing done that needs to be done, and we look at whether or not we were comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges, your legacy is going to be that of a truth teller. You're going to be one of these people who said, I know I'm going to take some heat. I know I'm going to be criticized. I am not trying to be political about this. I am simply trying to look at readily available public facts. And if you look at this, how can you deny the fact that some of these numbers are being massaged and it's squishy and murky? Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. You know, Scott, I was giving a talk just a week ago, and I was laying out a timeline. And sometimes I'm putting together my PowerPoint at the last minute. I was going to do this after you were off, but I want to show you something that has got me staring at my ceiling as I try to go to sleep at night. I want to show you a timeline. I'm not sure if you've looked at this, but do you realize that in February of this year, actually February 17th, we had been watching what's happening in China, and then the top disease official, of course they're talking about Anthony Fauci himself, says the risk of coronavirus in the USA is minuscule. Skip masks and just wash your hands. Saying don't bother wasting your time with masks and things like that. We don't have a real issue. I've looked at the science. I work with the Wuhan labs. I know what we're talking about. February 17th, he says this really is a non-issue. If we're healthy, we should do just fine. Then something shocking happens. I can't explain it, but from February 17th, suddenly on the 28th, so 11 days later, someone who is not a doctor, but is one of the #1 funding bodies, the WHO, makes this statement. Bill Gates, coronavirus may be once in a century pathogen we've been worried about. This is 11 days after Tony Fauci said this is a non-issue. Bill Gates makes the exact opposite statement, saying, I have been preparing for this. We've been running Event 201. We've been doing clinics on this. And I am telling you, this is what we're preparing for. He's not a doctor. He funds WHO, Gavi. You know, we can talk about investments into vaccines and all of those things. I mean, that itself is a shocking timeline. And man, I wish I was a fly on the wall in the phone calls that went, why did we go from Fauci saying non-event to within 11 days? No, this is the great pandemic of our lifetime. But take a look at this. That's February 28th, right? Bill Gates made this crazy statement. I believe he even put more funding in the WHO right around those days. But within 4 days, on March 4th, our own government CDC agency puts out a brand new guideline on how we are going to count COVID-19 deaths for this now announced pandemic by a man who's not a doctor but seems to have a lot of controls over public health around the world. And here's what this document told doctors to do. It is important to emphasize that coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 should be reported on death certificate for all dissidents where the disease caused or is assumed to have caused or even just contributed to death, just as you described there, Dr. Jensen. If the dissident had other chronic conditions such as COPD or asthma that may have also contributed, these conditions can be reported in Part 2, the problem you are pointing out. But this is, I think, the most shocking. What happens if the terms reported on the death certificate indicate uncertainty? If the death certificate reports terms such as probable COVID-19 or likely COVID-19, these terms would be assigned the new ICD-9 code, which I assume is caused by COVID-19. It is not likely that NCHS will follow up on these cases, basically telling doctors, if you want to bring in some extra income and you want to make this assumption and you don't do a test to prove it, don't worry, we're going to look the other way on this. This happens 4 days after Bill Gates announces that this is going to be a massive pandemic. Suddenly, we change the way we have always counted deaths, which you have got to assume is going to skyrocket the rate immediately. When I was putting that together last week, my jaw dropped. Have you looked at that timeline before? And do you not find that sort of synergy of the public world announcements and how conveniently we made a shift that would show or create a pandemic, if you will, just by simply changing the way we calculate the numbers?
You're absolutely right, Dale. And actually, another thing happened too. The World Health Organization came out and said that the code for COVID-19 that was laboratory confirmed would be U07.1. But if you were going to make an assumption or a probable, it would be U07.2. At the same time, the World Health Organization came out and said that, United States and CDC said, well, we're not going to use U07.2. The message being, if you use that, if you say probable, which would normally be U07.2, it'll automatically default to U07.1, which means that if you say probable, it's just as good as confirmed. And when you do that, we're then told, oh, and by the way, don't worry, you won't be audited. On top of that, a month after February passed, we had Dr. Fauci in the New England Journal of Medicine once again saying that COVID-19 was behaving like a bad flu epidemic. So even in that time, there continued to be this conflicting data, and Dr. Fauci was in the middle of it, saying, oh, and that article in the New England Journal of Medicine had a co-author, a guy named Robert Redfield, who was head of CDC. So it is absolutely astonishing how many stumbles, bumbles, and hiccups we've seen out of the World Health Organization, the CDC, and anybody else who wanted to join the conversation if they had enough money.
Well, I think, Dr. Jensen, what you're doing is critical. I've never seen, in all of my investigations with the doctors for 6 years, the work I've done on the high wire, I have never seen modern medicine take a step back in the quality of its data collection, to actually take away information and have less information hiding underlying causes as a part of the discussion. This is an incredible moment in history. I hope that you are leading the way, that we truly do have an audit. Because, look, there will be viruses in the future. We've lowered the bar pretty low. 0.26% death rate warrants shutting down this nation. But we need to know how we're counting it, and we cannot compare this year's apples to last year's oranges. We do not have any way of knowing what coronavirus deaths would have been last year, or flu deaths, when I'm talking about 2019 in terms of heart disease and cancer. They have turned this thing entirely on its head. It is so good to know that someone out there cares and is doing these audits. We will do everything we can to support you and hopefully make this a nationwide campaign. Thank you for your efforts, and thank you for your continued diligence. And you have been under a lot of fire for the work that you do. You truly are a hero, Dr. Jensen, and it's a privilege to know you.
Thank you, sir.
Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.